In just 67 seconds, $24 billion spent and 0 gallons of water delivered were about to destroy the agricultural credentials of a governor who promised solutions while farms died. Gavin Newsom didn't expect a fourth-generation farmer holding bankruptcy papers. He didn't expect documentation proving $18.3 billion went to consultants who never built anything. Cameras captured the exact moment infrastructure promise met consultant corruption. The committee room watched as dying crops and green vineyards collided in unbearable contrast. What did those financial records reveal about where Delta Tunnel money actually went that made even agricultural Democrats demand criminal investigation? September 9, 2024, 3:17 in the afternoon. California State Senate Agriculture Committee hearing room, Sacramento. The late summer heat pressed against the windows as Governor Gavin Newsom entered with his trademark confidence, prepared remarks about long-term water infrastructure investment and sustainable agricultural future, ready to defend what he called California's most important water project. What he didn't know was that sitting in the third row was Robert Yamamoto, a third-generation farmer from Fresno County, holding the bankruptcy filing that would end his family's 120-year legacy. And he had evidence that would prove the Delta Tunnel project wasn't infrastructure investment at all. It was the largest consulting fraud in California history. The hearing had been called to examine the Delta Conveyance Project, commonly known as the Twin Tunnels. The massive infrastructure plan promised to solve California's perpetual water crisis by building 2 tunnels beneath the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, moving water from Northern California to Central Valley farms in Southern California cities. The project had been in planning since 2010. 14 years of studies, environmental reviews, engineering assessments, and public hearings. The estimated cost had exploded from $9 billion to over $24 billion. And despite spending billions, not a single foot of tunnel had been constructed. Not 1 gallon of water had been delivered. And California's most productive agricultural region was dying of thirst while waiting for infrastructure that would never come. Senator Brian Dahl, a Republican from Lassen County and himself a farmer, had spent 8 months investigating where the $24 billion had actually gone. What he discovered would redefine government waste and expose how infrastructure promises became political slush funds enriching consultants while farmers went bankrupt. The morning session had featured testimony from water district officials explaining the engineering complexity of tunneling beneath the delta. Environmental consultants discussed endangered species protection. Metropolitan Water District representatives described urban water needs. Standard bureaucratic testimony that justified delays while avoiding accountability for spending billions without results. Then Senator Dahl began his questioning at 3:17 p.m. Governor Newsom, the Delta Conveyance Project has been in planning since 2010. That's 14 years. Can you tell this committee how many miles of tunnel have been constructed? Newsom consulted with his Water Resources Director, then responded with carefully chosen words. Senator, the Delta Conveyance Project is currently in the advanced planning and environmental review phase. Construction timelines depend on completing necessary regulatory processes and, Governor, I didn't ask about timelines. I asked how many miles of tunnel exist. The answer is 0, correct? The directness forced acknowledgement. Correct, Senator. Construction has not yet commenced. 0 miles of tunnel after 14 years and $24 billion in spending, Dahl repeated, letting the numbers hang in the air. Let me ask another question. How many gallons of water has this project delivered to Central Valley farmers? Newsom shifted uncomfortably. Senator, as I indicated, the project is still in planning phases. Water delivery will occur once construction is completed and, so 0 gallons delivered. 24 billion spent, 0 miles built, 0 gallons delivered. Is that accurate? The mathematical reality was undeniable. The project requires extensive planning before construction can begin. These are complex engineering and environmental challenges that, Governor, let's examine where that 24 billion actually went, Dahl interrupted, pulling out a thick audit report. This is a forensic accounting analysis conducted by the Legislative Analyst's Office at my request. It traces every dollar spent on the Delta Conveyance Project since 2010. He opened to a flagged summary page. Of the $24 billion spent, how much would you estimate went to actual construction or land acquisition? Newsom consulted his staff, clearly uncertain about numbers that should have been readily available. Senator, I don't have specific breakdowns immediately available, but the majority of early-phase funding goes to necessary planning and the answer is $5.7 billion, Dahl said, displaying a chart. $5.7 billion went to land acquisition and preliminary site work. That's 24% of total spending. Governor, do you know where the other $18.3 billion went? The number was staggering. $18.3 billion unaccounted for in Newsom's understanding of the project. Senator, comprehensive infrastructure projects require extensive consulting, engineering studies, environmental assessments, legal analysis, and coordination across multiple agencies. These are necessary investments in consultants, Dahl interrupted with controlled fury. $18.3 billion to consulting firms. Not construction, not tunnels, not water delivery, just consulting. He held up the audit report for cameras to capture clearly. Let me read from the executive summary. Quote, analysis reveals that 76% of Delta Conveyance project expenditures have been paid to consulting firms for planning, coordination, environmental review, and project management services. Despite 14 years and $18.3 billion in consulting fees, the project remains in preliminary planning with no construction timeline established. End quote. The revelation that 3/4 of project spending had gone to consultants who delivered nothing was devastating. Governor, $18.3 billion to consultants. That's more than the entire annual budget of 23 states. That's enough money to build 4 Golden Gate bridges. And what did Californians get for $18.3 billion? 0 miles of tunnel, 0 gallons of water. Newsom attempted to defend the necessity of thorough planning and environmental review, but Dahl had documentation that would prove the consulting spending wasn't about careful planning. It was about enriching political allies. Governor, let me show you something interesting about these consulting contracts, Dahl said, displaying a network diagram showing connections between consulting firms and Newsom's political operation. This chart shows the top 20 consulting firms that received Delta Tunnel contracts. Combined, they received $14.2 billion. Now, these red lines show political donations from these firms and their executives to your gubernatorial campaigns, recall defense, and affiliated PACs. The web of red lines connecting every major contractor to Newsom's political fundraising was visually damning. Collectively, executives and PACs associated with these 20 consulting firms donated $8.7 million to your political operation between 2018 and 2024. That's an $8.7 million investment that generated $14.2 billion in government contracts, a return of 1,633 to 1. The numbers transformed infrastructure spending into a political investment scheme. Donate millions, receive billions. But let me highlight one particularly egregious example, Dahl continued, clicking to a specific firm. AECOM Engineering received $4.1 billion in Delta Tunnel contracts for project coordination and management services. Their executives donated $2.3 million to your campaigns. Can you explain what $4.1 billion in project coordination delivered when 0 miles of tunnel have been built? Newsom had no adequate response. What could justify $4 billion for coordinating a project that hadn't started construction? Governor, the audit found that AECOM subcontracted 91% of their actual work to smaller firms for $700 million. That means they kept $3.4 billion as pure profit for essentially being a middleman. $3.4 billion in profit funded by taxpayers for a project that delivered nothing. The exposure of contractor profit margins was politically catastrophic. Newsom's signature infrastructure project was a scheme to funnel public money to private consultants. But here's what makes this truly criminal, Dahl said, his voice rising with moral outrage. While consultants got rich doing nothing, California farmers are going bankrupt because they can't get water. He displayed a map of the Central Valley showing water allocation percentages. The numbers told a story of agricultural devastation. Central Valley farmers currently receive 15% water allocation, 15% of their historical water rights. Crops are dying, orchards are being torn out, farms that survived the Great Depression are going bankrupt. And why? Because the water they were promised through the Delta Tunnel never came while $18.3 billion went to consultants. The contrast between consultant wealth and farmer bankruptcy was morally intolerable. Governor, let me introduce you to someone who can explain the human cost of your consulting boondoggle, Dahl said, gesturing to the gallery. Robert Yamamoto stood slowly. He was 61 years old, wearing work boots and a faded shirt, his hands showing the calluses of 61 years working California soil. His family had farmed in Fresno County since 1904. For generations, 120 years of feeding America. And that legacy was ending because Gavin Newsom had chosen to enrich consultants instead of delivering water. Mr. Yamamoto, would you like to tell Governor Newsom about your farm? Dahl asked gently. Robert approached the microphone with the slow steps of someone who had fought nature, markets, and now government, and lost. He placed a folder on the podium containing documents that represented the end of everything his family had built. Governor Newsom, my great-grandfather Kenji Yamamoto started our farm in 1904. 20 acres of stone fruit. He was an immigrant from Japan, worked harder than anyone I've ever known, built something from nothing. His voice carried the weight of generational legacy. My grandfather expanded to 240 acres, survived the Depression, survived being sent to an internment camp during World War II, came back and rebuilt. My father expanded to 800 acres. Almonds, walnuts, pistachios, stone fruit. By the 1980s, we were one of the most productive farms in Fresno County. He paused, gathering strength to describe what came next. I took over in 1997, expanded to 6,000 acres. We were doing $23 million annually in crop value, employed 147 people year-round, fed families across America and exported globally. The past tense carried unbearable finality. In 2010, you announced the Delta Tunnel project. You promised it would solve our water crisis. You said farmers would have reliable water within 10 years. We believed you. We invested in new orchards, new equipment, new infrastructure. Banks gave us loans based on your promise of water delivery. Robert's voice began to crack. For 14 years, we waited. Every year, our water allocation dropped. 18%, 16%, 15%. You can't farm with 15% of needed water, Governor. Trees die, crops fail, soil becomes dust. He opened his folder and pulled out photographs. Dead almond orchards, acres of trees torn out because they couldn't survive on 15% water. Empty fields that once produced millions in food value. Last year, I lost $83 million in crop value. Orchards I planted 20 years ago died because I couldn't water them. I had to lay off 94 employees, people who had worked for my family for decades, some for 2 generations. Tears began streaming down his face, but his voice grew stronger. This March, I filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. 120 years of family legacy destroyed. My great-grandfather survived racism, internment, and the Depression. But I couldn't survive your broken promise. He held up the bankruptcy filing for cameras to capture. Official court documents ending the Yamamoto family farm. Governor, you spent $24 billion and delivered zero water. While you paid consultants, my family's legacy died. But here's what really destroys me. Robert pulled out another document. A water allocation report showing district-by-district percentages. While I get 15% allocation, you know who gets 100%? Urban areas. Los Angeles gets full allocation. San Francisco gets full allocation. And your Plumpjack Winery in Napa Valley gets 100% allocation. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. While farmers went bankrupt on 15% water, Newsom's personal business received full allocation. Governor, I looked it up. Your winery uses approximately 400 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of wine. You're making wine with full water allocation while my food crops die on 15%. Explain to me how that's fair. 67 seconds of testimony. That's all it took. A fourth-generation farmer describing how $24 billion in consultant spending and broken water promises had destroyed 120 years of family legacy while Newsom's winery operated at full capacity. Senator Dahl seized the devastating moment. Governor, Mr. Yamamoto isn't alone. We identified 147 Central Valley farms that have filed bankruptcy in the past 3 years. Combined, these farms represent over 400 years of agricultural heritage, all destroyed while you paid consultants $18.3 billion to plan infrastructure that never materialized. He displayed financial projections. The legislative analyst estimates that at current spending rates, the Delta Tunnel won't be operational until 2047, 23 more years, another $31 billion in projected costs. By then, Central Valley agriculture will be dead. The farms that feed America will be gone, but the consultants will be rich. Newsom attempted to respond with standard talking points about infrastructure complexity and environmental protection, but Robert Yamamoto wasn't finished. Governor, I have one question for you, Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. You spent $4.1 billion paying EECOM to coordinate a project that hasn't started. My entire farm operation, 6,000 acres, 147 employees, generated 23 million annually. That's the economic value I created feeding people." He paused for effect. AECOM got 4.1 billion for doing nothing. I got 15% water allocation and bankruptcy. Why was enriching consultants more important than saving farms that actually feed Americans? The question exposed the fundamental perversion of priorities. Consultants who produced nothing received billions while farmers who fed millions received nothing. Senator Dahl had one final piece of evidence. "Governor, let me share the full financial picture of your Delta Tunnel failure. 24 billion spent over 14 years. If we had simply given that money directly to Central Valley farmers as water infrastructure grants, we could have funded drip irrigation systems, water recycling facilities, and drought-resistant crop programs for every farm in the valley. Instead, we gave it to consultants and now farms are dying." He displayed the alternative calculation. 24 billion divided by 6,000 Central Valley farms equals $4 million per farm. We could have given Robert Yamamoto $4 million for water infrastructure. Instead, we gave AECOM 4.1 billion for paperwork. The arithmetic of waste was devastating and undeniable. The hearing concluded 73 minutes after it began, but the political damage was complete and irreversible. By that evening, video of Robert Yamamoto holding his bankruptcy papers while describing his family's 120-year legacy had been viewed 147 million times. The split screen of dying orchards next to Newsom's green vineyard became the defining image of California's agricultural crisis. Within 72 hours, 9 Democratic state senators called for criminal investigation into Delta Tunnel contracting. The FBI announced review of potential fraud in infrastructure spending. And Robert Yamamoto received calls from 463 other farmers facing bankruptcy, each with similar stories of broken promises and destroyed legacies. The Delta Tunnel scandal exposed the catastrophic corruption at the heart of California infrastructure policy. $24 billion spent enriching consultants while farms died. 18.3 billion in fees to produce zero results. 4.1 billion to a single firm that subcontracted most work and pocketed the difference. And 147 family farms destroyed while waiting for water that never came. Robert Yamamoto's great-grandfather had survived racism and internment. His grandfather had survived the Depression. His father had built one of California's most productive farms. But Robert couldn't survive Gavin Newsom's choice to prioritize consultant profits over agricultural survival. Sometimes the most damning evidence isn't complex financial fraud or legal violations. Sometimes it's just a farmer holding bankruptcy papers and asking why his family's 120-year legacy mattered less than enriching consultants who never built anything. 24 billion spent, 0 miles built, 0 gallons delivered, 147 farms destroyed, and 67 seconds of testimony that proved infrastructure investment meant nothing when corruption determined where money flowed. In the end, AECOM got 4.1 billion for coordination. Robert Yamamoto got bankruptcy for actually feeding Americans. And Gavin Newsom learned that some promises, when broken, destroy more than just credibility. They destroy legacies, livelihoods, and the agricultural foundation of the nation's most productive state.